You probably won't believe this. Most people wouldn't, but if I don't tell someone, I think I'll lose my mind. The first time I heard about the lighthouse at the end of the world, it wasn't from a friend, or an ad, or some casual story. It came to me like an accident, or maybe like something that was meant to find me. It was a Tuesday afternoon, cold, grey, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones and makes the air taste like rust. I was sitting in my tiny apartment, jobless for almost 2 months, staring at an unpaid stack of bills. The only sound was the slow ticking of the clock and the occasional groan from the old pipes in the wall. That's when the email arrived. No sender name, no subject line, just a single sentence in the preview. We have a position for you. I don't remember clicking on it. It felt like my fingers moved before my brain could catch up. Inside was a short message. No company name, no friendly greeting, just a block of text. Position, lighthouse keeper location. Remote northern sector, accessible only by boat. Term for weeks minimum. Compensation $10,000 upfront, additional upon completion. Requirements: maintain light function, monitor weather patterns, log all activity in daily journal. Warning: never enter the lower hatch after midnight. Reply if interested. That last line, the warning, should have been the part that made delete it. But instead, it did the opposite. I read it again, and again. $10,000 just to keep a light running and write in a logbook. It sounded ridiculous. Too good to be real. But that strange part, never enter the lower hatch after midnight, hooked into me. Hooked into me. Why would they say that? Curiosity. That's what got me. It always gets me. I hit reply before I even thought about it, typing out 2 words. I'm interested. The response came within the hour. Fast, like they'd been waiting. This time, there was a phone number and an instruction. We will call you in exactly 3 minutes. Keep the line open. 3 minutes later, my phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm, like every word was measured. It was a man, maybe in his 50s, with the faintest accent I couldn't place. Mr. Head, that's me. You understand the location is remote. No cell service, no internet, no visitors. Supply drops only every 10 days. Do you understand? Yes. You understand the compensation is contingent on following the rules at all times? Yes. You understand that things happen in that sector that may not have explanations. There was a pause before I answered. What kind of things? Another pause. Then, flatly, if you're asking that, you're not ready for this job. I don't know why, but those words made something inside me tighten, not with fear, but with stubbornness. I'm ready. There was a faint sound on the line. Not breathing, not static, something else. Like the slow slosh of water against metal. Very well, he said. You leave Friday. Be at Dock 6 in Port Norland. Bring only what you can carry. A boat will take you the rest of the way. Click. No paperwork, no contract, no confirmation. Email. It was only after the call ended that I realized I had never once told them my name, or my phone number. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. I packed clothes, a heavy coat, a flashlight, my old camera, and a small leather journal. Part of me kept waiting for a follow-up, some official instructions, but nothing came. Friday morning, the sky was the color of wet cement. I drove to Port Norland, a decaying fishing town that smelled like diesel and salt. Dock 6 was at the far end, past rows of rotting boats and empty crab traps. That's where I saw the man who would take me to the lighthouse. He was tall, gaunt, with skin weathered like driftwood. His raincoat looked older than me. Without introducing himself, he pointed to a small boat tied to the dock. You're going to the end, he said, his voice like gravel. Not many come back from there. I tried to laugh it off. I'm just there to keep the light running, right? He looked at me for a long time, his eyes pale and cloudy, like he'd spent too many years staring at the horizon. The light's the least of your worries, he muttered. We set off. The town faded into grey mist behind us. The trip took hours. The sea was restless, heaving under us like something alive. The sky darkened, though it wasn't yet noon. At one point, the man slowed the boat, scanning the water. You feel that? He asked. The boat rocked gently. I don't feel anything. That's the problem, he said. Out here, when the sea goes quiet, it's watching. I didn't know what he meant, but my skin prickled. By the time the lighthouse appeared in the distance, the air had grown colder, sharper. It stood on a jagged outcrop of rock, surrounded by black water. The structure was tall, weathered, its white paint stripped away by years of storms. No other land was in sight. The man didn't bring the boat all the way to the dock. Instead, he stopped 20 feet short. This is as close as I get, he said. What? Why? Water's too deep here. Things under it. They don't like my boat. Before I could question him, he shoved my bag into my hands and motioned toward a small wooden rowboat tied to the stern. You'll take that to the dock. Keep your eyes on the lights. Don't look down. I rode the last stretch alone. The air was so still, it felt wrong. No wind, no waves lapping the sides, just the sound of the oars dipping into water. Halfway there, I broke his rule. I looked down. At first, All I saw was darkness, then movement, shapes, far below, gliding in slow circles. The water was too deep to make out details, but I could tell they were large, larger than anything I'd ever seen in the ocean. One of them paused directly beneath me. I froze, the shape tilted upward, as if it was looking at me. Then, something flashed in the darkness, a faint, greenish glow. By the time I reached the dock, my hands were shaking. I tied the boat and climbed the narrow metal steps to the base of the lighthouse. The heavy door groaned as I pushed it open. The air inside was warmer, but it carried a faint smell, brine, metal, and something else, like the scent of deep, stagnant water. In the center of the main room was a spiral staircase, winding upward into shadows, and there, at the base of the stairs, was a hatch, heavy, rusted, bolted shut. A small warning plate above it read, "Do not open after midnight." I stared at it longer than I should have. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was here for a job, that $10,000 was worth a few strange rules, but deep down, I already knew that hatch would not leave me alone. The first night at the lighthouse was wrong. Not terrifying, not yet, just wrong. You know that uneasy silence before a storm hits, the kind that feels heavy, pressing on your ears, like the world is holding its breath. That's what the lighthouse felt like from the moment I stepped inside. I closed the main door behind me and set my bag down on the floor. The sound of the latch clicking shut echoed far too loudly for such a small space. My own breathing seemed to bounce back at me from the curved walls. The inside was dim, lit only by thin strips of daylight slipping in through the narrow windows. Everything was metal and cold to the touch. The floor, the stairs, even the railing. I ran my fingers along it and felt little beads of condensation, as if the whole place sweated with the same chill that had sunk into my bones. The spiral staircase stretched up into darkness, and down toward the hatch I'd seen. Earlier that hatch had no handle, just two thick bolts sealing it shut, both rusted but still solid. The warning plate above it was dented, as if something had struck it from the inside. I looked away. I told myself the upper floors needed to be checked first. Climbing the stairs was harder than I thought it would be. The steps were narrow and steep, the metal groaning under my weight. The higher I went, the colder the air became. On the third floor, there was a small living space, a single bed, a battered desk, and a stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. On the desk sat a stack of logbooks, each one marked with a date range. The most recent one was labeled simply, "Keeper's Log, Winter Cycle." I opened it. The handwriting inside was messy, written in a rushed scrawl. At first it was just mundane notes, weather patterns, light maintenance reports, supply schedules. But as I flipped through, the entries began to change. Day 12, lights under the surface again. Closer this time, they follow the boat during drops. Day 14, heard knocking from below hatch, not answering. Not again. Day 17, if they get in, there's nowhere to go, only up. The last page had just one sentence, "It knows when I'm alone." I shut the book. My fingers felt colder after touching it. I forced myself to keep going, finally reaching the top floor. The lantern room. It was larger than I expected, with a huge Fresnel lens at the center, surrounded by glass panes scratched by years of salt and wind. The view stretched endlessly in every direction, nothing but black water and gray sky. The light mechanism hummed faintly, its slow rotation casting fractured beams across the sea. For a moment I felt almost calm. Then I saw them. Far below, in the water around the base of the lighthouse, faint green lights shimmered. They moved in slow, deliberate patterns, circling. I told myself they were bioluminescent fish, deep-sea squid, something normal, but my gut twisted, because these lights weren't random. They moved in sync, like they were part of something bigger. Every time the beam from the lighthouse passed over them, they seemed to rise, just slightly closer to the surface. Night fell fast out here. One moment there was pale light over the horizon. The next there was nothing, just darkness swallowing everything but the circle of water directly around the lighthouse. Inside, I lit a single oil lamp and sat at the desk. I didn't have much to do until my first scheduled inspection of the lantern mechanism at midnight. The quiet was oppressive. No gulls, no wind against the glass, no creak of wood, just the faint sound of the sea lapping against the rocks below. Dan, bang, a sharp, metallic thud from below. I froze, listening. Another bang, this time followed by a deep, dragging scrape, like something was moving across the floor beneath me. I thought about the hatch, about the dented warning plate. The noise came again, this time directly below where I sat. The floor vibrated faintly. Under my feet, I told myself it was the tide, rocks shifting underwater. Anything but what my brain kept picturing, something large in the dark space under the lighthouse, moving around. Midnight came. I climbed to the lantern room to check the mechanism. Everything was fine, the gears were turning, the light was steady. But when I stepped outside onto the narrow balcony, I realized the water below wasn't calm anymore. The green lights were back, dozens of them now, and they were closer. I gripped the railing, my breath fogging in the freezing air. As the beams swept over the surface, I could see shapes in the water, not fish, not anything I could name. The lights weren't just glowing randomly, they were eyes, and they were all looking up at me. I backed into the lantern room and slammed the door shut. When I got back down to my quarters, something new was waiting for me. The hatch bolts. They looked different. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks in the lamplight, but no, the top bolt was slightly bent, as if it had been struck hard from below. A fresh flake of rust lay on the floor beside it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair, lamp burning low, listening to the occasional faint knock from under the floor, wondering if $10,000 was worth staying here another minute. But the strangest thing was, some part of me wanted to open that hatch. I didn't open the hatch. That's the only reason I'm still here to tell you this. But that night, something tried to convince me otherwise. I remember staring at those bent bolts for what felt like hours. My mind kept circling back to the same thought. If I just looked inside, maybe I could understand what was happening. It wasn't curiosity in the normal sense, it was heavier. Like the idea had been planted in my head. I finally forced myself to crawl into bed, keeping the oil lamp on. My eyes wouldn't close. Every time I started to drift off, a sound would jolt me awake. A faint tap, a whisper of water moving below, the subtle grind of metal dot. At around 3 in the morning, I heard something new. A voice. Not clear, not loud, but definitely a voice. It came from beneath me, muffled by the thick iron floor. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was strange, not threatening, not even urgent, almost coaxing. I stayed in bed, holding my breath, telling myself it was the wind, but the voice kept coming, slow and deliberate, pausing between phrases as if waiting for a response. I didn't give one. The next sound I heard was worse. A slow, rhythmic thump, traveling from one side of the floor to the other, like something pacing directly under me. I finally snapped. I grabbed the lamp and stepped toward the hatch, my bare feet cold against the metal floor. That's when the smell hit me. It was faint at first, salt and rot, like seaweed left to decay in the sun. But as I got closer to the hatch, it grew thicker, heavier, until my throat burned from breathing it in. I froze halfway across the room. Something scratched the underside of the hatch. Not a claw, not a nail. Something sharper, metallic, dragging slowly across the iron like it was testing the material. Then silence. When I woke, the lamp had burned out and the room was dark. I checked the hatch bolts first. The top one was still bent, but now the bottom bolt had a long, thin crack in it, fresh, with flakes of rust scattered across the floor. Something had been working on it while I slept. I didn't touch them. Instead, I forced myself to focus on my daily tasks, checking the lantern mechanism, logging the weather, maintaining the small generator in the storage room. But my eyes kept drifting back to the hatch. I told myself I wouldn't look again until nightfall. By late afternoon, a storm rolled in. The kind you feel before you hear, the air growing heavy, the sea darkening in slow shades, until the water looked like oil dot from the lantern room balcony. I could see massive swells crashing against the rocks. Spray reached almost to my feet. The green lights were gone, but I didn't feel relieved, because I knew they were still down there, somewhere in the black water below the waves. Night fell with the storm still raging. I lit the lantern and secured the shutters on the lower windows. Rain hammered the glass in the lantern room, and the wind howled like something alive. I told myself the storm would drown out any noise from the hatch. I was wrong. Around midnight, the banging started again, louder now, sharper, like something was striking the bolts directly. The sound carried up through the metal, making the floor vibrate. I sat in my chair, gripping the arms, heart pounding. Then came the voice again, clearer this time. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I knew, but the rhythm, it felt like speech, rising and falling in deliberate patterns, as if the thing down there was telling me something important or issuing a command. The strange part was, the longer I listened, the more it started to make sense. Not in words, exactly. More like feelings, images. The dark, the cold, the endless pull of the tide, and one other thing, a deep gnawing hunger. The last thing I remember from that night was standing over the hatch, with my hands on the bolts. Not trying to open them. At least, that's what I tell myself, but feeling the cold iron under my palms, the vibration of something moving just inches away on the other side. It was only when lightning struck nearby, shaking the whole structure, that I stumbled back. Didn't sleep. I just sat in the dark, listening to the storm, trying to ignore the quiet tapping from below that never really stopped. I think the hatch had been waiting for the storm. That night, the sea hit the rocks with such force I could feel each wave in the soles of my feet. The tower groaned under the wind's weight, glass panes shivering, metal beams creaking like old bones. I told myself the structure had stood for decades, that it could handle this, but my gut told me otherwise. Around 2 in the morning, a sound cut through the wind and waves, a sharp pop, followed by a hollow clang. I knew instantly what it was. A bolt. I grabbed the lamp and rushed downstairs, my bare feet slapping the cold iron steps. The smell hit before I reached the hatch, heavier than ever. Not just rot now, but something sweet and cloying, like meat left to fester. The first thing I saw was the top bolt, the one that had been bent for days, lying on the floor, snapped clean in half. The crack in the lower bolt had widened, flaking rust across the hatch cover, and the hatch itself. It was trembling, not from the storm, from something underneath, pressing upward in slow, steady pulses, as if testing my resolve. I backed away, holding the lamp out like it could keep me safe. My mind was a mess, half of me screaming to run up to the lantern room, the other half telling me to stand there and see. Then the first sound came. A wet, dragging noise, like something pulling itself over stone. It was followed by a hollow, almost gulping breath. The metal shifted again. I saw the edge of the hatch rise just half an inch before snapping, back down with a clang that echoed up the tower walls. My knees felt weak. I ran back up, slammed the hatch door at the top of the stairwell, and locked it. My breathing was ragged, my skin prickling with cold sweat. I didn't sleep, didn't even sit. I just listened to the sounds below. Hours passed. The storm started to fade. That's when I realized I wasn't hearing the thing anymore. No scraping, no tapping, nothing, for a while. I let myself believe it had gone back into the water, but then came the knock. 3 sharp raps. Not from the hatch this time, but from directly beneath where I stood in the lantern room. I froze. Then, a pause. And 3 more knocks. Slow, measured, deliberate. I couldn't move. The hair on my arms stood on end. Whatever was down there had made its way up inside the tower walls. The knocks came again, this time from the opposite side of the room. It was moving around me. I grabbed the emergency flare gun from the supply shelf and loaded it with shaking hands. The tiny weapon felt useless against whatever I was dealing with, but it was all I had. The knocking stopped. For the next hour, I stood in silence, flare gun aimed at the floor. Then I heard the whisper, not from below, from right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the reflection of my own lamp in the glass. My ears rang with the rush of blood in my head, and then a dark, wet smear appeared on the inside of the lantern room glass. It started small, like a handprint, but the shape was all wrong. The fingers were too long, the palm narrow, the lines twisted like rope. I stumbled back, the flare gun raised, even though there was no one in the room. The smear slid slowly downward, leaving a trail behind by the time I worked up the courage. To get closer, it was gone, evaporated, leaving only the faint scent of brine and decay. When dawn finally came, I forced myself downstairs. The hatch was still in place, but now both bolts were broken. Only the hatch's own weight was keeping it shut, and that wasn't going to last. I had 2 choices: try to reinforce it, or run. The problem was, the supply boat wasn't due for another 4 days, which meant I wasn't getting off this rock. I spent the day scavenging for anything to hold the hatch down. Chains, rope, heavy crates from storage. I piled everything on top of it until the hatch groaned under the weight. By nightfall, I was exhausted. My arms ached, my head pounded, but even as I worked, I knew it wasn't enough, because whatever was under there was patient, and patient things don't give up. I had been telling myself for days that I didn't want to see it, that as long as I never laid eyes on whatever was under that hatch, I could pretend it was just a storm-born hallucination, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I think I knew. It was inevitable. The day after I'd weighted the hatch with crates and chains, the weather turned unnaturally still. The sea wasn't calm, it was flat, the kind of eerie stillness that feels wrong in your bones. No wind, no waves, no birds. That it was the silence that did it. That perfect, unnatural silence that lets you hear everything you're not supposed to. Like the scrape of metal from below. It started slow, just the faintest grind of iron against stone, but I could hear it through the soles of my boots. The sound wasn't random, it was deliberate. Scrape, pause, like claws. I crept halfway down the stairs, my oil lamp low so it wouldn't cast light down to the hatch. The chain I'd looped over it was swaying gently, rattling against the crates. That's when I heard it, a deep, slow inhale. Not human, too wet, too hollow. The hatch shifted, just enough for the chain to go taut. The crates creaked under the strain. I gripped the railing so hard my knuckles ached then. I saw them dart. At first I thought they were fingertips, but as the pale shapes pushed up through the gap in the hatch, I realized they were too long, too thin. 4 of them, jointed wrong, bending backward at the middle like a spider's legs. The skin, if you could call it that, was pale grey, almost translucent, with faint blue veins running through it, and they were wet. Every movement left a slick trail on the hatch. The fingers, or whatever they were, curled upward, pressing against the chain, testing it. One of the joints cracked audibly, the sound sharp enough to make me flinch. Then, in one fluid motion, they slid back through the gap, and the silence returned. I stood frozen for nearly 10 minutes before I dared go back up. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the lamp. But just as I reached the lantern room, I caught something in the corner of my eye movement on the water. I stepped closer to the glass, squinting against the glare. Out there, maybe, 50 yards from the base of the lighthouse, something broke the surface. At first, it looked like driftwood, but then it moved deliberately. It rose higher, the water sheeting off in dark rivulets, until I realized I was looking at a head. It wasn't like any head I'd seen before. Elongated, smooth, with no hair, no ears. The skin was the same pale, grey as the fingers, glistening in the light. Where the eyes should have been, there were only two deep hollows, dark and glimmering faintly, as if reflecting something behind me. It stared at the lighthouse. At me, I couldn't look away. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it slipped back under the surface without a ripple. I backed away from the glass, my chest tight, my mind scrambling for an explanation. A deep-sea creature, some deformed seal, and my brain kept reaching for answers, but none of them fit the wrongness I'd just witnessed. I went to the logbook and wrote it all down, not because I thought anyone would believe me, but because I needed it on record in case I didn't make it off this rock that night. I didn't even try to sleep. I sat on the lantern room floor, flare gun in my lap, staring at the hatchway door. Toward around midnight, the knocking started again, but this time, it wasn't alone. Underneath the knocks, I heard something else, a low, rhythmic hum, almost like a song coming from beneath the lighthouse. It was soft, almost gentle, but it crawled into my head and settled there, filling me with a deep, cold dread I can't describe. I don't remember lying down, I don't remember closing my eyes, but I do remember waking up to the sound of the hatch open. Just an inch, and seawater slowly pooling across the floor. The smell was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't the sharp, salty tang of ocean water I'd grown used to. This was wrong. It was thick, briny, and sour, like something dead had been soaking in the sea for far too long. I sat up fast, my head pounding, the flare gun still in my hand. The hatch below stood slightly ajar, and water lapped in slow, deliberate waves against the base of the stairs. But the tide wasn't high enough to explain it, which meant it wasn't just water coming in. I crept halfway down the steps, my bare feet cold against the damp wood. The chain I'd wrapped around the hatch was loose, hanging uselessly from the hook. Something had undone it. The water seeping in was strangely dark, as if it carried silt from deep below, but every now and then, I saw it shimmer faintly under the lantern light, as if it had a thin film of oil over the surface. It was cold, unnaturally cold. I tried pushing the hatch shut again, but it didn't budge. It felt like something on the other side was holding it, not yanking or forcing it open, just holding it still, waiting. Then the humming started again, soft, steady. It vibrated through the hatch and into my hands. This time it was joined by another sound, slow splashes circling below, as if whatever was down there was pacing. I stumbled back up the stairs, not daring to take my eyes off the hatch. I'd barely made it to the top before I heard it. A single heavy step on the first stair. Water dripped onto the boards. Then another step, and another. The sound of it climbing was deliberate, each footfall echoing in the hollow space of the lighthouse. I could hear the water trickling down with every movement. I retreated to the lantern room, heart pounding, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the flare gun steady. Then, silence. No footsteps, no humming, just the steady drip of water. I edged toward the spiral opening, peering down. At first, I thought the stairwell was empty. Then I saw it, a single hand gripping the railing 2 flights below. Those long, jointed wrong fingers curled around the wood, the pale skin slick and stretched. The knuckles, if they even were knuckles, bent at angles that made my stomach turn. It didn't move, didn't climb higher, it just held there waiting. I fired. The flare, the scream that tore out from below, wasn't human. It was deep and wet, gurgling in a way that rattled the glass of the lantern room. The hand yanked back instantly, vanishing into the shadows. A loud splash echoed from beneath the hatch. Then, nothing. I stayed in the lantern room until daylight, shaking, the acrid smell of burnt flare powder lingering in the air. My clothes clung to my skin with cold sweat. When I finally dared to check the lower level, the hatch was closed again. The chain was back in place, but not the way I'd wrapped it. It was tied in a knot I didn't recognize. I wanted to radio for help, God knows I did, but the radio was gone. The entire unit had been unbolted from the wall. In its place was a small puddle of that same dark, oily water. And in the middle of the puddle, a fish spine, perfectly clean. The rest of that day passed in a haze. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that humming, faint but constant, coming from somewhere deep in the walls. I thought I was losing my mind, but that night, when the humming stopped, I realized I had been hearing it for days, and I missed it. Silence felt worse, like it meant the thing wasn't outside anymore, it was inside. The first sign came at sunset. The light above me, the single, steady beam that cut through the fog for miles, flickered just once, but it was enough to make my stomach knot. That lamp was built to withstand storms, salt spray, even lightning strikes. It didn't flicker, not unless something made it. I climbed to the lantern room, hands gripping the rail tight, eyes fixed on the great glass lens. Everything looked fine. The mechanism still turned, the bulb glowed hot and white, but the shadows on the walls moved wrong. They didn't match the motion of the lens. Some shapes didn't move at all. The sun sank lower, the horizon swallowing its last streaks of gold. I glanced down through the stairwell, and for just a moment, I saw it again, a hand, pale and dripping, resting on the railing 2 flights below. Only this time, there was another one, opposite side. The hum started again, stronger. It wasn't coming from below now. It was vibrating through the iron beams of the tower itself. I could feel it in my teeth. I ran down to check the generator. It sat in its little room, still chugging along, but the gauges were all wrong. The pressure was off the charts. The heat dangerously high. Then the bulb in the ceiling popped. The room plunged into darkness. I scrambled for my flashlight. The beam cut across the room in a shaky arc, catching the glint of something wet on the floor. Not water. It was thicker, almost black. It led away from the generator toward the hatch room. The same hatch I'd chained. When I reached it, the chain was gone, not hanging loose. Not on the floor. Gone. The hatch was wide open, and the sound of the sea rushing below was deafening. But I knew it wasn't just the sea. There were breaths in that sound. Slow, heavy, wet. I backed up the stairs, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when the beam above flickered again, twice, then went out completely. The light was gone, and with it, the last thing keeping this place from being swallowed by darkness. The ocean outside seemed louder without it, like the water was pressing in on the walls. Then I heard it, not the hum, not the breathing. A voice. It whispered my name. I froze halfway up the spiral stairs. It came again, a wet, guttural whisper, dragging my name out like it had all the time in the world. I knew it wasn't human, but it knew me. A sudden rush of cold swept through the lighthouse, extinguishing my flashlight like someone had blown it out. I was left in the dark, and in that blackness, just before my eyes could even adjust, something touched my ankle. It was cold, not the kind of cold you get from seawater. This was the kind that went through you, like it bypassed your skin entirely and sank straight into bone. I jerked my leg back, but whatever had touched me didn't grab. It just withdrew, slowly. Like it wanted me to know it was there. The darkness felt thick, like it had weight. Every step I took up the spiral stairs sounded too loud, echoing in ways that didn't make sense. The air was wet, heavy with the smell of salt and something else, something metallic. Blood. Halfway up, I stopped. I couldn't hear the waves anymore. The hum was gone too. There was just silence. And in that silence, I realized something that made my skin crawl. I couldn't hear myself breathing either. A faint sound broke the stillness. Drip. It was coming from above. In the lantern room, the light had been dead since the flicker, but a faint glow now pulsed through the cracks in the trapdoor above my head. It wasn't the clean white of the lamp. It was sickly, greenish yellow, the color of something that had been rotting too long. I pushed the trapdoor open just enough to peek through. The room wasn't empty, it was crowded. Figures stood shoulder to shoulder in a tight circle around the great glass lens. Their backs were to me, but their shapes weren't quite human. Too long in the arms, too narrow in the torso. Every single one was dripping seawater onto the floor. Drip. The glow came from inside the lens, swirling in slow, unnatural patterns. Then one of the figures twitched. Not a head turn, not a step, just a sudden, violent shudder, like something had yanked it from the inside. I must have made a noise, because the next sound I heard was them breathing in unison. Wet, heavy, slow. They turned, not all at once, but one after another, until a dozen pairs of milky, colorless eyes were fixed directly on me. I dropped the trapdoor and bolted down the stairs. My boots slapped against the iron steps, the sound echoing too close behind me. They weren't just following, they were inside the walls. When I reached the main level, the hatch to the outside was open. I didn't remember opening it. The sea was right there, violent, black, endless. But between me and it stood one figure. Closer now, close enough for me to see the pale, swollen skin stretched too tight over its bones. Close enough to see that it was smiling. It whispered again, my name, and this time, it wasn't alone. The whisper came from every direction. From the walls, from the floor, from the air in my lungs, from the water outside. I knew then that whatever was here, whatever had always been here, wasn't something I could just escape. It had been waiting for me. I didn't remember deciding to move. My feet just started carrying me toward the spiral staircase that led down, not up. It didn't make sense. Down was where the maintenance tunnels were, the flooded foundations, the parts, the old keepers, sealed off decades ago. But the whisper in my head, it wasn't telling me to run anymore, it was telling me to come closer. The metal steps groaned under my weight, each one colder than the last. The deeper I went, the more the air changed, thicker, wetter, with a sour taste that clung to the back of my throat. Somewhere above, I could still hear them moving, not running, not chasing, just following. Like they already knew I wasn't. Getting out the first landing was ankle deep in seawater. The second was knee deep. By the third, I had to wade each step, sending ripples out into the darkness. The water was warm in a way that made my stomach knot, like it wasn't seawater at all. I kept my flashlight tight in my hand, but the beam didn't seem to cut very far. It felt like the darkness was swallowing it. Something brushed past my leg. Not fast, not aggressive. Just enough to let me know I wasn't alone. The lowest level was almost fully submerged. Only the upper half of the maintenance hallway was above water. The walls here were stone, slick with algae, and covered in markings I couldn't recognize. Loops, jagged lines, symbols that felt wrong to look at for too long. And the hum, it was back, louder than before. The hallway ended at a rusted metal door. It was half open, water sloshing through the gap. The glow I'd seen upstairs was seeping from inside. I pushed it open. The room beyond wasn't a maintenance chamber. It was bigger, much bigger than the lighthouse should have been able to contain. And in the center, rising up from the water like it had been waiting centuries, was the source of the light. It looked like a stone pillar, but it pulsed, as if it were breathing. The glow came from deep within it, swirling like liquid fire. Shapes moved just under the surface, too fast to follow, too strange to identify. The whisper in my head was gone. In its place was a voice, not words, not exactly. Meaning, it told me I had been brought here, not by accident, not by the storm. It told me that every keeper before me had faced this choice: stay and become part of it, or try to leave and be taken anyway. The water rose another inch around my legs. Something wrapped lightly around my ankle, not pulling, just holding. The pillar pulsed faster. The glow spread through the room, and for a heartbeat I saw them. The figures from upstairs, the ones in the walls. Only now I could see their faces. Clearly they weren't strangers, they were the keepers. Every one of them. The voice grew louder. The hum shook my ribs. The choice was mine. Stay, or try to run. And in that moment, I realized the most terrifying thing of all. I didn't know which one I wanted. The water was almost at my waist now, warm and thick, lapping against my ribs with an unnatural rhythm. Not waves, but a pulse, as if the ocean itself had a heartbeat. The pillar's glow painted everything in a sickly goldman, and the air vibrated with that low hum until my teeth buzzed. I could barely hear my own thoughts over it. Maybe that was the point. Maybe it didn't want me to think, it wanted me to listen. I could still see their faces, lined up along the walls. The old keepers. Their eyes were wide, glassy, but their mouths moved in perfect unison. No sound came from them, but I didn't need it. The words were inside me now. You don't leave. The voice, or whatever it was, shifted. It stopped sounding like something ancient and alien, and started sounding like my own voice, whispering to me from deep inside my skull. It reminded me of every moment I'd been alone here, every shadow I'd seen move, every time the wind had carried something that wasn't just the sound of the sea. It told me I belonged here. Something moved in the water behind me, slow, heavy. I didn't turn. If I turned, I knew I'd see it. The thing that followed me through the stairwell, the thing that brushed my leg in the dark, the thing that had been watching since the storm first hit. Instead, I looked down at my hands. My fingers were pale, wrinkled like I'd been underwater for days, and I realized, maybe I had. The voice pressed harder, urging me forward, toward the pillar. My mind split in two. One part wanted to fight, wanted to run up those stairs, break through the boarded door, throw myself into the freezing black ocean and take my chances. The other part saw how still the old keepers looked, how peaceful. A sudden, sharp cold cut through the warm water around my legs. I looked down. Blood, gribbons curling through the glow. Something tightened around my ankle. This time it pulled, fell forward, my hands slamming into the water, my flashlight slipping from my grip and vanishing into the glow. The hum became a roar. I came up gasping, and the pillar was right in front of me now. The shapes inside it churned faster, pressing against the surface, like they were trying to get out, or trying to get in. The voice asked me one last time, stay, or be taken. I wish I could tell you what I chose. I wish I could tell you I made the decision myself, but the truth is, I think the lighthouse made it for me. When I woke up, if I woke up, the storm was gone. The sea was calm. The sun was bleeding through the clouds in pale, thin light. I was standing at the top of the lighthouse, looking out over the water. My clothes were dry, my skin cold. And in the glass of the lantern room, I saw my reflection. Except it didn't move when I did now. At night, I hear the next keeper's footsteps in the stairwell. They don't know it yet, but I'm waiting. For them, no one ever leaves the lighthouse at the end, and no one ever truly arrives in the end. There's only one certainty. The world you see might not be all that exists. Leave a comment about what you think, and if you dare, come back. Here tomorrow, there's always another story waiting for you. But remember, some stories never end.